All right, everybody, let's get started. Welcome to the MSR monthly conversational colloquium. It's the conversational colloquium because we encourage a lot of interaction with the speaker, so feel free to ask any questions you have. I hope that's okay with you, Colin. So today I'm very pleased to have Colin Kammerer here from Caltech. He's the Kirby Professor of Behavioral Finance and Economics at Caltech. He got his PhD from the University of Chicago, where his thesis was titled The Validity and Utility of Expert Judgment. So I'm quite pleased to hear his expert judgment on the topic of behavioral economics, which in sort of general terms is the study of how humans actually behave in situations without assuming they're sort of mathematically optimizing machines, but that they have psychological and behavioral biases that might impact the decisions and economic actions that they take in the course of their lives, which of course drastically would impact the systems that we're designing for these agents. So it's really important to understand these issues. And Colin is one of the leaders in this area. His research is at the interface of psychology and economics, and he tries to develop psychological and also neurobiological foundations for models of behaviors and preferences to explain things like market bubbles. So please welcome Colin.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me. This is such an interesting group. Okay, here's the title. Peter Landry and Ryan Webb are my co-authors on this, shown here. Before I do that. So a few weeks ago, we painted our house and moved a shoe rack. So usually we come home and put our shoes in the shoe rack or near the shoe rack, depending where they end up from being kicked, if you're 10 years old or me. And the shoe rack used to be here, and then we moved it to there. So the first day after the painters left, I walked over to the shoe rack, didn't see it. My confabulating brain immediately thought, who stole the shoe rack? Then I realized nobody stole the shoe rack had just been moved. Okay. The next day I come home, I stop a little sooner and realize the shoe rack is not there. The next day I stop a little sooner, and basically this is an animal extinction experiment, it's called. And I'm the animal. And after about 2 weeks, I confidently strode to the shoe rack like, now I know where the shoe rack is. And so, age notwithstanding, I'm going to call what I did a habit, which is a sort of overtrained action, which, because it became habitual, I'm going to try to say as precisely, a little bit neurobiologically and also empirically, what it means to be exhibiting a habit. What it means to be habitual was that I was kind of acting as if I had utility from the action of moving toward the shoe rack, even though it didn't achieve really my goal, which was to get my shoes in the right place. Okay, so there's a kind of decoupling or an upstream transfer of reward from the goal achievement to the actual execution of this motor sequence. Okay, another motivating example, this is Jennifer Beal, as pictured in her 6-year role. 6 years is important in a TV show called The L Word, which was set in West Hollywood, where we used to live. And she's dressed in what's called in the L Word language the power lesbian suit, which is kind of a mixture of sort of traditional male and female feminine things. Anyway, so she played this lesbian, she's herself heterosexual, and she played a lesbian for 6 years in this TV show. And what the quote says is that I had spent 6 years playing Bette, her character, and flirting with women and being with women as this character, she said in an interview. And then she got in a new show called Lie to Me. And she said, when I got to Lie to Me, being on a set and being in a power suit, so it just happened either with Hollywood typecasting or somewhat coincidentally that her character was supposed to dress in a very similar way. That's important, right? So she gets onto the TV set wearing this power lesbian suit, and her brain thinks I'm playing a lesbian character. Okay, so this illustrates again another type of habit, which is that she's in a particular kind of environmental situation that has sort of cues associated with it. She's wearing a particular distinctive uniform, and 6 years of having worn this uniform and pretending to be a lesbian made her think that she's like a lesbian. And I like the quote also because she says her brain, which is the right place to locate it. Well, body too. Okay, so that's again something like a habit. This is almost a mental habit or a frame of mind. and by the way, our prediction from this type of study is if we had videotaped her the first few days she was filming Lie to Me, the prediction is that she would act like a lesbian, depending on how good of an actress she is, right? So she might be able to instantly toggle from the lesbian-inspired mannerisms associated with being in this particular outfit and this particular set, and because in Lie to Me she does not play a lesbian. But for most people, this kind of overtraining would lead them to overact a little bit like a lesbian because of this action-instigated action sequence. Okay, I know some of you, a lot of you will know this extremely well, others not. But anyway, the alternative to something like habit, and in fact, what I'm going to show you is a kind of a hybrid two-process model which has habit and standard maximization, is that people have utilities, which are summarized by a utility function, a kind of numerical function of the amounts of goods consumed. The goods are 1 to n, conditioned on some kind of belief or information vector that's just there for a bit of completeness. And this is what I'll call, preference maximization or constrained utility maximization or rational choice, and subject to some income constraint. And so when people are in habit mode, they're not maximizing this. But they're doing something sort of approximately optimal in some sense, although we haven't really derived exactly what that means, but I think you could derive the model I'm going to put forth as a solution to some kind of interesting optimization problem, but we haven't done so. Okay. I'm going to give you a quick preview. I'll say a little bit about background psychology and neuroscience. I'll spend most of the time in here on a computational model. That's the way in which we use the words computational model is sort of a splice of how it would be used in, say, simple microtheory. It's going to be a very simplistic model, not fancy. And in computational neuroscience, I'll say something about elasticities, and then hopefully we'll have time for other empirics. And this is an example of neuroeconomics or decision neuroscience, which is the attempt to use neurally implement evidence about neural implementation of particular algorithms as a basis for theories of economic choice, which can predict and explain two quite different types of data, which is direct data on neural observation, as well as traditional economic data, which include things like scanner data, not from brain scanning, but barcode scanner data, like Nielsen data, from lots and lots of consumers, purchasing yogurt and diapers. And we are working on some data like that, but we don't have any new results. So the idea is to be able to say something about both choices and then other things which are neural or psychological markers of being a habit choice versus a more rational choice mode.
Colin?
Yeah.
Just in terms of what would count as what type of a model, we can think of the brain as a factory that's producing decisions, and in factories we have to install modules that allow us to do various things, and lots of models of the firm say that those modules are costly to take out or put in. At some level of abstraction, could you sort of view this as that way? I install something that makes it easy for me to go get my shoes when I come in the door, and it sort of takes a while to remove that, or some adjustment costs.
Yeah.
Like that.
I'm going to show you what essentially is a reduced form model of an unborn model that has in which the latent costs, either switching costs or cost of time, are what's going to justify sometimes being in habit mode. Another way to think of it is a pilot flying an airplane in which you want to put things on autopilot relatively rapidly when you think the reward from autopilot generating habitual behavior is going to be reliable enough in a numerical sense. But you also want a sensor that's going to tell you when to interrupt the autopilot. And so it's getting into and out of habit gracefully that's really going to be the key. And that's why you might think of this as approximately optimal or very likely to be approximately optimal if you wrote down a model to explore that. Yeah.
Is there going to be a way to observationally differentiate habits from
Yes.
repeated activities that are intentional? Right? So I come to work every day. That's not a habit. That's my choice. Whereas your story about the shoe rack.
Well, first I'll show you some basic neurobiological data. Then I'll also talk a lot about elasticities. In fact, since you brought it up. So a lot of the stuff we do in neuroeconomics is pretty exotic. Like we're interested in regions like amygdala and trying to understand what things like emotions mean, which are a little difficult to map onto standard economic categories, though not impossible. But the main thing we're going to go after here, that's not, we're going to use a neurally inspired model to study price elasticities. Is there anything more boring and basic, right? Glenn is an expert in price theory. Elasticities we measure them a lot. I know. That's not meant as an insult. Anyway, price elasticities, right? How cool is that? So there's a lot of data on price elasticities. We can get more. A lot of the temporal grain of the price elasticity data is not necessarily, for this type of project, we want to start to be looking at elasticities like on the daily level or the weekly level. A lot of them are estimated like with quarterly or annual data because older data came in these chunkier ways. And so a lot of the predictions will be about things like elasticities. And then obviously I'm interested in other cognitive predictions like how fast decisions are made, whether people remember what they did, whether they can explain to other people. And for those we'll probably have to construct some lab experiments. But yeah, we're all about that, about distinctive predictions. Okay, a quick preview just to see some language. So I'm going to distinguish again a kind of two systems. In the neuroscience literature, there's something called two controllers or two systems or two processes. There's some evidence, I'll show you kind of a glimpse for a dissociation of these two systems. In other words, different brain areas are active, and then there's some kind of competition among the systems for, we like to say, for control or for control of the chooser. One is called a model-free, or sometimes called model-free habit. The idea is that you face a state, like I walk into my house, Jennifer Wheels walks onto the set, you go to the store, and that will consist of a choice set, prices, some kind of information vector, a particular location. It might be, for example, when I walk to the Tops, which is a fast food place at a particular store, there's a Tops on Allen Avenue, and when I walk in there, and I usually get a BLT, that there's some kind of habit which is triggered by that particular location. And when you're in habit mode, you're going to make the same choice you did last time, which is going to be very simple to execute. You just think, you have a quick memory retrieval, what did I pick last time? And then we're going to consult a number, which is the reward reliability. If that's pretty low, we just execute the habit. So it's very easy. You just look up two numbers, and you perform a simple Boolean inequality calculation. It's going to be fast and low effort, but it's inflexible. So if things change and the habit's now a mistake, I'll keep mistakenly doing it, like my shoe rack, and it's backward looking. So if somebody says, oh, the price has gone way up, it just goes in one ear and out the other. The model-directed system, and the word model-directed here is kind of inherited from, I think, Sutton and Bartow, perhaps, and others. And by model, we mean a model in a cognitive science sense of sort of a mental model of what actions lead to what consequences and how they're valued. So I think of it as maybe a decision tree. I'll give you a nice example in a second. And when we're in model-directed mode, we evaluate lots of different options. And we essentially, in our model, we're going to assume you do standard preference maximization. So we wanted to have a kind of standard model to be one chunk of what's going on. And this is going to be slower and take more effort, but it's flexible. So if prices change, you're looking at everything on the menu, and you won't habitually buy something that's suddenly gotten expensive because the ingredients are out of season, and it's forward-looking. It's forward-looking. So this would allow things like rational addiction. Okay. Let me clarify about scope. This is important, and I just added this a few minutes ago. So the workhorse examples we have in mind, the things we're going to first try to explain empirically as we continue this research program, are regular decisions that are made on a pretty periodic basis. What that really means is they're going to be analogous to the animal literature that led to this development of a particular concept of habit. So that's something you do every day or every week. The best example is going to be like food. You have to eat all the time, often at the same time in a similar place, or commuting. And there may be other things that fit in this category. So eventually we're going to be looking at, we have some ideas about commuting data and driving habits, and also supermarket, like I said, scanner data for consumer purchases. I'm not going to consider two other domains in which habits are interesting. One in which there is a genuine kind of switching cost because of learning by doing. So you buy a particular car, and then gas prices go up or gas prices go down, and you don't immediately switch because you don't want to have to learn to drive a new car or something like that. And I'm also going to avoid, even though neuroscientists are quite interested in this, biologically addictive substances, in which probably it's more sensible to say that your preferences have actually changed, or that if you've consumed heroin, that your body has a homeostatic opponent process, which then changes your taste for more heroin or something like that. So those are incredibly fascinating, important topics. But I don't think of the shoe rack as being a biological addiction, or Jennifer Beals' power suit lesbianism as being something like a substance addiction. So those are fantastic, and the words habits often used, but not by me.
But the learning by doing versus this distinction is really sort of like what part of the brain is adapting?
Well, the examples I have in mind, I don't think there's much real learning by doing. Like the shoe rack, you know.
But at some level, you are sort of like, you're learning to have a different part of your brain more quickly do something that would otherwise be done slowly by another part of your brain, right? Or is that not?
Well, let me put it this way. Let me go back to the one canonical example, which is, in other words, walking here toward the shoe rack wasn't lots easier than walking there. You know what I mean? You know, it's not as if there was like a minefield, and I'd successfully learned to avoid the mines in the old location, and now when I walk to this new location, I have to go really slowly. You know, because that's not what caused me to do it. But I mean, I take your point in general, which is that that's why it's useful to have a mathematical model and to be looking at things. Is that the standard concept of learning by doing, like learning curve, some variant of that might be what's going on here, but I'm not sure. And it's a lot different than like learning to build a ship.
I mean, if you learn how to play like baseball, we do know that like moves things from like cognitive to more automatic processes, and we probably would call that learning by doing.
Yes.
But it has some similarities to your description of what goes on with your habit. It's really just that like macro things that might take me a long time to become micro.
Let me give you a quick thing that I want to move on, which is, so when I say we're not going to consider habits that have a large component of learning by doing, I mean, in other words, if you were forced to make a different choice, the organisms can do it pretty quickly right away. Right away. Okay, let me move along. Okay, so what do we mean by model directed? Here's a great example. Thank you, Maps. And so,
not Bing Maps, not Air Maps.
Sorry. That's because of my habit. Sorry, my Android. So if you were to, the other day I gave a talk in Rand, and we visited our friends in Manhattan Beach. So if I were to live in Manhattan Beach and commute to Caltech, which would be fun to do. But, so this is a fantasy model. What model directed means is, suppose my regular commute is, probably would be here. And for some reason, you know, I hear on the radio, oh, there's tremendous traffic in downtown LA, which is the red strip, right? If I'm in habit mode, I just keep driving. I just pay no attention to what's in the radio. If I'm in model-directed mode, what I would do is I would imagine alternative routes. I would have some kind of probably distribution over how slow they might be. I might think, well, gee, you know, can I afford to stop downtown and like have a coffee somewhere or do something interesting or stop at a USC and see my friends there? I might think, gee, if I go on this route, I go by Rain and a Corn, which is a great Thai restaurant, and I can pick up some Thai beef jerky, blah, blah, blah. And so this is what what we mean by model-directed choices. We have something like this in mind, either in front of us on the app or in our heads. And so it shows you alternative routes. And if we have a really good model, it may even have exactly this kind of information. It takes this long, and there's a detour, and there's going to be traffic. You know, I might hate traffic particularly because it's stressful. So there's a stress cost, and when I think about full pricing, all these things. So that's what we mean by model directed. So when we're not in habit mode, we may be considering alternative routes in a way like that. Okay, so here are the interesting questions, which is how exactly do these systems work, and what is the evidence for two systems? I'll give a whirlwind tour of the beginnings. How do people shift between these systems? The core thing is going to be what we call doubt stock or reliability signal. This is sort of an audience design, and Peter Landry wanted to have a kind of Chicago-y idea of a stock, a number that's going to move around, that's going to be a driver of the behavior. In computer science, decision neuroscience, sometimes we say reliability. And the idea is that if habits yield low reward repeatedly, then you get a low doubt stock, and that justifies the habit. If the doubt stock goes up, because the habit unexpectedly gives you a lower reward, like you run into traffic or the yogurt tastes bad, then we're going to transition to the model-based. Yeah.
So I could imagine thinking of many things that are in between. So just basically at some level, there's what you pay attention to and then how you process it. So sort of inputs that you acquire and then algorithms that you use to process that lead to outputs. So I'm wondering how much of this you think is being a super useful false dichotomy, habits and models, or whether you actually think this is literally it. There are two kinds of ways to think about how people.
Well, if it's a false dichotomy, then I would prefer it to be a super useful false dichotomy if I get to choose. I think I'll show you some of the neuroscience evidence, which is suggestive of two systems and how there's a shift back and forth. But in decision neuroscience, there's a little speculation about maybe other systems that involve episodic memory in a way that's different than here, or that involves spillovers across habits. Like if you develop one sort of physical habit, that might generate a predisposition for another, so that there's sort of linkage, like a biological linkage. But I'm going to put that aside. Okay. I'll say one quick thing about here, which is if you think that the idea of developing a rapid automatic habit is somehow dysfunctional for humans, other animals live this way, and it helps them survive. And so there are many, many times in which evolution has kind of built in or adapted in different kinds of habits. For example, a classic example of what are called fixed action patterns, studied by Nico Tinbergen. He and his brother are the only sibling pair to win two Nobel Prizes in economics and medicine. And Tinbergen discovered this interesting species of fish called sticklebacks. Male sticklebacks have a red belly, females greenish and swollen. And the sticklebacks are very territorial, the males. So if a male swims into his territory, they'll fight. If a female swims in, they'll try to have sex. It's basically like a fraternity house. And if you carve out a little piece of wood and paint it red on the bottom and put it on a stick and stick it in the aquarium and wiggle it around, the male stickleback will come over and try to fight. So this is what's called a fixed action pattern. There's sort of a stimulus it's sort of like the sufficient statistic, the red belly, right? Not only that, there's another property, this is just fun fact, it's called a supernormal stimulus by Tinbergen. Not only that, if you put this stick in, it has a big red belly, and you put an actual male stickleback, which is exaggeratedly red-bellied, it'll fight this one, not the real thing. The same with the animal, with the female. So if you put a female in, an actual female versus this exaggerated version of the female, like this cartoon enhanced female, it'll go after this one, right? The other female fish is thinking, I'm not swollen and gray enough for you? Swollen and silver enough for you? The answer is no. Okay. So, and these are things, by the way, the animals will not get extinguished. So you could do this over and over. Another example is my golden retriever, who always chases a squirrel, has never caught a squirrel, so has never learned from reinforcement that chasing squirrels is great. Friends of ours have a golden retriever. They said that their golden retriever actually did catch a squirrel and didn't even know what to do with it. It's sort of like, I don't know, why did you catch the squirrel if you're not going to eat it? I run after squirrels, And so this is just evidence of not even habits, something that's usually called reflex or prepared behavior. And so these things are pretty prevalent. It's not like humans having the capacity to habituate would be some terribly maladaptive thing. It probably would be very good.
It's like the scorpion who stings the frog and sinking in the lake.
Yeah. There are a lot of cool examples. Let me spend just a bit of time on this, but fast. This is one of the earliest things I think is nice to illustrate how the biology shows up. This is by Anne Grabel's group. So this is classic T-maze training. The rat starts here. There's going to be food at one of the ends of the maze. It's randomized usually. What happens is they run down here. When they get to this point, they hear a tone. The tone is going to be typically perfectly associated with the location of the food. So if they hear beep, It's going to be up here, beep, it's going to be down here. And they train this over many, many trials. Here's the training data. It takes about 4 training phases. This is percent correct, so it's, they can turn left to right. 50-50 means they just haven't figured it out at all. But after about 3 or 4 trials, boom, it jumps up pretty rapidly to 80%. So now they've figured out what tone tells you where the food's going to be. And in addition, the duration falls, so they get more accurate and faster. The quicker duration is going to be one of the most natural markers of habit and easy to measure. And in addition, these are neural spike rates in striatum, I believe, at different points in time. So these correspond to the start, the tone, the turns. And what these heat maps next show you is, this is what they call the reorganization of neural firing over 9 training days. So they do this like lots and lots and lots of times for little bits of food. This is basically how they get fed. And what the bright red colors show, as you go from blue to red, from cold to hot, what the bright red colors show is the amount of firing in either all task-related neurons or just in striatal neurons. The pictures are pretty similar. Firing rates at different points in the training. So early on, a lot of the action happens here when they get near the goal and have to decide. The brain is busy, right? After a little bit of training, that backs up. And now what happens is you don't have any special activity as you get near the food. So what the brain is generating is at the start, right? And also notice there's a little blue sag here. So early on, when you get to the tone thing, it's like the brain just shuts off. It's like, okay, I'm waiting for the tone. You hear the tone, off you go. And there's a little blue strip here. What happens is you start to get more activity at the beginning. And what happens is the rat gets in the maze, and this is what we call kind of reward prediction error learning. What happens is the rat has now learned, once I'm in the maze, I'm getting fed. So the prediction error is now associated with being at a state which will lead to food. And there's some, but there's less activity in response to actually getting the food. So this is the sense in which they've learned to sort of acquire value for a position in the maze. And at the end, you see this blue part here. Basically, you get a little bit of activity. Okay, food's coming. And this is like they're commuting and paying no attention to where they're going. They know the food's coming, and so they're using this scarce rat executive function to daydream about something else. Okay, so this shift in where the neural activity is an indication of this kind of mental habituation where the value signals are taking place. Okay. And by the way, let me point out one other thing, which is I'm gonna treat the economic modeling as maybe a little bit of a caricature, but I'll certainly try not to do that too aggressively or mistakenly. But the standard view in economic modeling of habit, as I understand it, has been to think of habit as something like a state-dependent change in preferences. So if you've consumed a particular thing a lot, that increases your utility for future consumption. And there certainly may be some cases where that's appropriate, like biological addiction and even learning by doing. But we want to kind of construct a habit model that does not have that property. Right? It's not a change in preferences. It's simply generating an autopiloted type choice because it's generating reliable reward, not higher reward, reliable reward. So that's the key distinction. As Annie asked, also we want to be sure that we can cache this out in terms of seeing something observable in data. My co-author Sylvia, yes. Be nice.
I'm curious how this relates to Pavlovian reactions, because it sounds kind of similar, right?
Yeah. So this is what's called operant conditioning, or instrumental conditioning, or I like to call it active conditioning. Yeah, and it's the same. It's in the same family of things. So the as you'll see in a little bit, the algebra is basically very old school reinforcement learning. And the difference is that the reinforcement of reward is then going to be kind of moved upstream to generate a kind of utility-like attachment to an action. And then the key is when the action is actually no longer functional, it will take a while for us to figure that out, for me to, like 2 weeks. Or maybe Jennifer Beals, maybe a month on set.
Okay.
Yeah.
Aristotelians are really into like habit, and like there's all this whole new
Yeah.
Aristotelian in the school. Do you think that this is the type of habit that they're talking about when they talk about the idea of becoming the sort of person who's inclined to do certain things?
maybe. I have till now successfully avoided reading that carefully enough to form an actual thoughtful opinion. But
there's definitely a community you could sell this stuff to.
yeah. I think there's an element of basically something like, if you do good things often enough, it becomes sort of natural and part of your character, and it may be associated with something like effortlessness or automaticity, and it's sort of like an investment in becoming a better self or something like that. But thanks for that shout out. Okay, this is a really crucial. I'm going to jump through a lot of things. Big step came in 1981. Chris Adams, in a very important solo-authored paper, a little bit underpublished, but later quite important, and Anthony Dickinson, who were studying animal learning, said maybe the way we should test habit is if you're in habit mode, and we actually devalue the thing you're going to get from executing the habit, you'll keep doing it anyway. And to me, this was the great breakthrough, even though my colleague John O'Doherty is a super expert on this, and he'd been telling me about this for years, and I'd heard some, and then one day I thought, that's kind of like inelastic demand. Interesting. So anyway, here's what the experiment is. So it is a particularly exotic form. So the rats are going to get trained instrumentally, again, operately. That means they're going to press a lever and get food, press a lever and get food. And they're trained, they get a little bit of food. This is done when they're hungry, so they're motivated. And this is very classic animal training. It's been done for decades and decades. Nothing special. What's special is, 1981, is they stop, and then the rats are allowed to eat as much food as they want. And in addition, the food has a little bit of poison in it, which is bad enough that it doesn't really harm them, but it makes the food taste really bad. And they quickly acquire what's called taste aversion. They don't want to eat that food anymore. Okay. And this is something that quite a bit is known about. And it's pretty persistent. And so then they're put in this test case where they can press a lever. And the rats see the food, and they should be thinking, I wouldn't even eat this food if I got it, so why should I press a lever to get food? But if they're in habit mode, they just press the lever. Okay? And so what you see is, with moderate training, 100 trials, in the valued control condition, they keep pressing the lever. The devalued control, they press the lever less. So that drop is the suppression of habit. There's still some habitual responding. It's about halfway, right? So this is habit, and this is model-directed suppression. But with 500 trials of training, there's no suppression. It's pure habit. So the rats are pressing this thing. Are you going to eat that? Oh, man, I hate that stuff. It makes me sick. Why are you pressing? Habit. Right? That's the idea.
And then they don't eat it.
Yes. Okay. Here's another example of ethanol habit. Again, the gap between these is the gap is suppression of habit, right? So if they were super smart, there'd be nothing here and something here. And after 1 week, there's some habit suppression, and then it go by 8 weeks, they don't have any habit suppression. So when we use the word overtraining, and the overtraining means training to the point in which you don't get this habit suppression. So this is what we call overtraining. Overtraining. Okay. This is again John O'Doherty, Bernard Belin. It turns out that if you lesion these areas in the rat, that's the slide I just skipped over for brevity. If you lesion this with a neurotoxin that kind of knocks out activity in that region, if you lesion this area, you get rid of habit, which means you see kind of rational choice basically, right? When the food is devalued, they don't press the lever. If you lesion this area, you get more of a suppression of model directed. So this is the evidence in rat brain for a dissociation between habit and model-directed systems. And my colleague did this with humans. The way you do it with humans, you don't poison the food. What you do is they get sips of either juice or milk. Some of them get juice, some of them get milk. You stop the scanner, they come out of the scanner. You tell them, drink as much as you want. So we assume that they're drinking up to satiation, where the kind of margin of utility is 0. So we've devalued the food by satiation, sort of short-run devaluation, right? And then they get back in, and they press levers. And what happens is that when they're in habit mode, they kind of click to get more of the stuff that they're already full on. You get activity in this dorsolateral region. So this is called a homology between similar areas of rat brain and human brain. Okay. So this is just a whirlwind tour. There's a fair amount of more evidence, not that much human evidence actually, but a lot of animal evidence of this kind of dissociation of these two systems. Okay, I'm going to skip that. So you know that we've been thinking about the economics. The word habit is used in economics in a bunch of different ways. So one is in macro finance, where these are called habit formation preferences. And the idea is that people care about consumption relative to some, say, historical average. So it's just a way of kind of ratcheting up sensitivity of consumption. We would call that in behavioral economics reference dependence probably, or something like that. So, okay, that's fine. I just wanted, so we're using the word habit differently. As I alluded to before, starting with Bob Pollack and others, including famously Becker and Murphy, the idea of a habit came to be associated with, or I would say came to be expressed as, the idea of adjacent complementarity of demand, of utility. The idea if I have more utility for consuming something, if I have a kind of history of consumption or habit stock. And again, that's an interesting concept. I think it's probably one reduced form way to think about biological addiction, but not what we're going to do. In marketing, there's something called brand loyalty, which is again is modeled as you're more likely to pick a product than you've picked before. And there's a lot of interesting evidence on state dependence, which basically means there appears to be a lot of persistence in consumption even when switching costs are low, or there'll be a benefit to switch or something like that. Some of these, there's a giant literature underneath them. I just want you to know that our concept of habit is different, and when we get further along, we will work as hard as we can to kind of distinguish them empirically. Okay. All right. So here's what we're going to do. So in this very stylized model, there's just going to be two goods, A and B. They're going to have known utilities, or let's say people have been through a kind of training phase where they figured out the utilities of two things. In addition to the known utilities, which are here, if each period you have to one of the two goods, A or B. And then you buy the good and you consume it and you get a feeling of the utility. If you buy good X, that is if your choice in T-1 is X, then you have this subjective reward expectation, which is updated as the decay of the previous reward plus lambda times updated by the new utility. Okay? And lambda is called the learning rate. Many animal learning models try to estimate this. We usually get numbers like 0.2 or 0.3 for human learning, depending on the time scales and stuff like that. Okay, and the idea is if you're choosing the same thing over and over and it has a stationary utility, depending on lambda, you'll quickly learn that R will match U. So R is something like a reward expectation of how it's going to really taste. And if you don't consume it, we just assume that R is the same. There's no decay or anything interesting. Okay. This is the main force in the model. This is called reward prediction error. Okay. Usually it's written the other way, on U minus R. The idea is we can think of this R as something like an expectation or prediction of the reward, and then U is the actual reward. And this doubt stock or reliability is going to be decayed previous doubt stock plus the new prediction error. And so again, if you're in habit mode and the utilities are stationary, this thing is going to shrink to 0. Right? Like suppose you start with R equals 0 and you know the utilities up here. You're going to just shrink. And again, depending on these values, the doubt stock will shrink to 0. And the idea is very simple, as I've said, is that when this doubt stock is low, i.e. reward reliability is high, then it's okay to use the habit. But when you're on autopilot using this habit, and all of a sudden the utility changes, let's say the quality is worse or the price is higher, then you're going to get an absolute value prediction error, and the reliability will go up. Reliability goes down, doubt stock goes up. And if that goes up enough, you switch out of habit mode to maximization. So that is you're constantly toggling between, you basically have these habits which have sensors. The sensors are this number, and when the sensors say, wait a minute, that didn't taste right, the shoes aren't there, I'm not a lesbian, then you switch out of habit mode. Okay, almost done with the model.
Something there about how that would capture like kind of variable reinforcement schedules and devaluation working slower if the rewards are more stochastic?
You know, variable reinforcement is a little bit puzzling from the point of view of these models because it should not work nearly as well as regular reinforcement, and of course there's a lot of evidence that it doesn't. I think people have have wrestled with this in the animal learning literature, that it may be the
Sorry, variable reinforcement is like when I call my dog, I don't always give him a treat.
exactly, yeah, and that actually often works surprisingly well.
And extinguishes really slowly.
And extinguishes slowly.
Stock, we would think that somehow the way that changes is different if the
Yeah.
reward is really stochastic.
Yeah. I think that's going to be problematic for us, but it is for a lot of decision neuroscience.
So it's relative to a reference level of doubt, right? It's like it's stochastic already, so I kind of expected it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it could be. I mean, it could have to do with where you set these thresholds, or it could be that there's some, like a model in which there's tolerance for error, like tolerance for reporting error, or something like that. But yeah, Marcus.
Do you think it's the right model that the sort of moving average of expected reward, or is it that I associate sort of initial reward, when I started doing my heuristic or my habit, and then when I move too far away from that initial thing, I start reevaluating. Different predictions about, this sort of thing, like this frog in the phenomenon.
Yeah.
Depending on this one.
Yeah, one prediction that's going to come from this is if you have slow degradation in quality or slow increase in price, if it's slow enough, you'll never switch because you'll never hit the barrier. You'll never pop over the sensor. So, a sharp price increase as opposed to a slow price increase will have different effects. Even if the slow price increase, for example, is anticipated. Like in a typical rational choice model, I might say, I'm going to raise the price 1% every week to the end of the year, as opposed to I'm raising the price 25% now, 25% later. Those would have different dynamics because the habit mode is not forward-looking.
So I could have a model where, I remember how much my initial commute time was, and then once it sort of exceeds 50 minutes more than that, I start looking at the.
Yeah, there are you could build in other kinds of exploration. I think where you might be thinking of. There may be other ways to sort of interrupt habit. This is just kind of the computationally one of the simplest ways to do it. And when you're in this world, you think, what did I do last time, and what's the doubts? How reliable is it? If it's low, I do it again. If it's low, I do it again. If it's low, I do it. And that could be exploited. Another way to think of it from an economic point, that could be exploited by quite a bit by continually making things a little worse, but not bad enough that you leave, or like an abusive relationship or something. Let me move along because I want to, if you don't mind. I know we're on a tight schedule. Okay, how do people choose? Very simple. If this doubt stock is low, i.e. the rewards are reliable, pick the same thing. Otherwise, switch. And so what we would like this thing to do, so we can generate some actual numerical predictions, is to kind of toggle sensibly back and forth between habit when it's reliably rewarding and deliberation or rethinking when there's a good reason to do so. Good reason means it moves above this threshold. Okay, now we're going to say something about elasticities. And so we're going to think about a model in which utilities are stationary until there's a one-time switch. And the utility of the product X goes down, that's a minus sign, by delta X. So you can think of that as a price increase, change it, the package shrinks, something like that. Okay. So we're going to usually think of these deltas positive, meaning bad. The product gets worse. And we're going to study things like long-run, short-run elasticity. Okay, so we're going to think about an aggregate demand curve where there's a unit mass of consumers, different preferences for A and B. Again, they have to buy one product each period, so they're perfect substitutes. And assume the initial utility difference is uniformly distributed. So there's some people who love A, they're not going to be very responsive to price, and some love B, and then there are people in the middle. And we're going to see how this entire, the aggregate demand moves. Okay, first thing is pre-habit maximization. And so up to a point, including, they're going to just, the demand curve will be responsive to both types of prices. That's when they're in standard maximization mode. And own price elasticities will be negative, cross price elasticities will be positive, nothing unusual happens. Okay. Now, after when they hit a certain point, that is, if price changes are low enough that they're in between negative and positive this number, the elasticities are zero. And the reason is that when you're in habit mode, the only way you're learning about a price increase is not forward-looking. The only way you're learning is that you consume the product and you get home and you like look at the thing and you realize, wow, eggs are really expensive. And if the price changes are small enough, you won't have any response. Because if they're small enough, they don't generate a big enough blip in the reliability signal to move you out of habit mode. And the size of this number is related to the reliability boundary minus the decaying function of the learning rate. And notice that if a lot of periods go by and you haven't changed, this number gets smaller and smaller. And basically the size of the price changes, which are big enough to keep you from not changing demand, again, it's bigger and bigger. And in the empirical literature, there's something like this. So you don't usually get zero elasticities. You get small elasticities like 0.05 or 0.01. And what happens is if price changes are, say, around plus or minus 10% of a reference price, you get much smaller elasticities than if they're outside of that range. That's not, again, intuitively very shocking, but it means that there's not constant elasticity of demand, as we usually are assuming that there's something like a flatter part and a steeper part. Okay, I skipped some other detail, but that's an ugly graph up here. Anyway, we can see, in principle, meaning on my computer, you can see some interesting things in a very old-fashioned graph in which we plot the change in the price of B and change in the price of A. So remember, up here, positives mean the prices have both gone up and utility has gone down. This is where it say both prices are better. Prices are lower or quality is higher. And so this is the zone of indifference. Sorry, this actually should be here. The pixels just popped up. Anyway, this is the zone of indifference. So for this set of price changes, the elasticities are 0. These two weird regions involve where the law of demand is violated. The reason why that happens is there's a change in the price of A that's big enough. So say you like A. The price went down a bit, big enough to trigger revaluation. But the price of B went down even more. So even though normally you'd be more like, there's some people who'd be more likely to buy A at the lower price, those people notice that B is a really, really good deal. So in other words, in this model, prices do two things. They generate substitution if you're not in the zone, but they also trigger revaluation. And if you have a combination of a low price change for the habit good and a high price change for the alternative good, you get a violation of the law of demand. Now, whether we're going to see this in the data, who knows? And interestingly here, you get oppositely assigned cross elasticities. So as I understand it, a lot of the empirical literature, when you look at cross-price elasticities, chicken and turkey, right, if their substitutes should both be positive, it should be chicken against turkey price, turkey against chicken price, you often get negative elasticities, probably because they're hard to estimate, but here it's actually a predicted feature of these unusual configurations.
So Colin, is that related to the paper on competing for consumer inattention? Just remember the JPA. It's like you try to avoid changing prices in a way that will cause the consumers to pay attention to what your price is, because then like
it could, yeah. I mean, certainly, attention limits are kind of baked into this notion of being in habit mode, right? You're only attending to previous choice and reliability, and you want to sneak under the reliability radar. Yeah, I'm glad you. I think I had seen that, but thanks for reminding me. Okay, I'm going to show just one more result and then some sort of fun fact type stuff. There's lots of evidence of differences in short and long run elasticities. Here's some. We had our RA find 5 passages from 5 textbooks about why are there differences in long and short run elasticities. There's no question that there's such differences. They're usually ascribed to sometimes adjustment costs, like for fuel, changing cars is not cheap, and there's learning by doing. Some of the definitions are kind of tautological. Like one textbook said, the reason why drug addicts exhibit inelastic demand is they don't respond to price changes. It's not really a causal statement, but somebody was tired of writing their book. And John Taylor, thank you very much, said what I think is exactly the right way we think about it, which is habits that are difficult to break. And remember, a lot of this evidence of short and long run, it includes things like diapers, yogurt. These are there's a lot of habits that are difficult to break. So it can see, again, drug abuse or fitness or health, there may be. But that's okay. But the part we like is in italics, which is the short run is a period of time before people have made their adjustments or changed their habits. And the long run is a period of time long enough for making adjustments. So this is exactly what we want. And now what we want to say is, can a model of the habits tell us when the transition occurs from short to long? And again, this is I don't know if this is a boring, mundane thing, but people are constantly asking, is there something that comes from neuroscience that gives you an idea of a mechanism that would say something about traditional economic concerns? What could be more traditional than elasticities? Okay, and so here's our very ugly, unfortunately we have a very ugly looking proposition, but the idea is if the maximum price change is in some bound, there's a lower bound and an upper bound, then the long run elasticity over many periods, sufficiently many periods, will be greater than the short run, which is 0. And the bounds are given by these expressions. So this we haven't quite deeply figured out what the interesting algebra is telling us. So anyway, I drew this on the graph. So here's the lower bound and the higher bound. And the idea is, for a particular values I pick, like this is lambda equals 0.3. That's a 0.3 learning rate. So it's pretty responsive learning. The lower bound is going to go from here to here. The upper bound goes from here to here. And so this point, the point at which they're equal, is if you have a price change of that size, this many periods is when you get a transition from short to long. So it's a very unintuitive function of these complicated expressions. So we get a definition of when the short run is. And I mean, again, I don't think that's that fascinating, but given that there's a lot of data on this, and it'd be nice to be able to say, can your model do something traditional? Here's something traditional. And we want to, and now we're collecting a lot of data on long run, short run estimates and seeing if we can somehow, really, are these individual level calibration parameters really kind of matching up a little bit with what we'll see. If it gets even close, I'd be very happy. Another thing you get kind of for free is there's some evidence of asymmetric responses to price increases and decreases. Usually that's ascribed to loss aversion. There's a really large literature on this. We also can get that as a kind of byproduct, which was surprising to us. Important point about habits is, okay, that's the end of that little model and what we can say about elasticities. As a neuroeconomist, when I think of testing a model, I know this is not the norm in economics. It probably won't be in my lifetime, but we could move in that direction. We think about data from choice. So for example, when people are in habit mode, we should see persistent choice, and just a kind of correlation of the time series of what they do. There should be low short-run price elasticities. The cross-price elasticities can be 0 or can be wrongly signed, asymmetrically signed. Choice speeds will be fast. Attention will be low. All you need to think about is what do they pick, and is it reliable? You don't have to look at anything else in the store. Purchase memories probably will be inaccurate. This doesn't come from the model. This is just an empirical hunch. And also, if you explain why you picked the choice, you may be unable to explain that. Being able to explain things is not a typical economic variable, but I think if you think of, say, the ability to teach people, and articulate things explicitly, I think you could tell a story in which part of human capital has to do with, or if you think about somebody, as a CEO and has to explain why their company does things a certain way, the ability to, whether you have an explicit understanding of choice or not, to us is potentially a kind of psychoeconomic variable. Okay. Here's an example about memory recall. So if something like cell phone use, you might think is a candidate for being habitual, right? You kind of pick up your phone and look at it, pick up your phone. It's a very particular motor action that you're constantly repeating, right? Even if, for example, even if your battery runs out and you pick it up and you see your battery run out, you may pick up your phone a couple more times before it sort of sinks in, right? That would be a kind of, again, overtrained habit in action. Or if you're at a conference and somebody says, please turn off your cell phones and don't look at them, right? And even though somebody told you that and you had this, the overtrained habit is like, look at the cell phone, look at the cell phone. Here's one example of evidence on memory. These are actual phone logs of how often people had checked their phones. And so they asked people, okay, during this particular period, how often did you look at your phone? And how often were you on the phone in terms of hours? And the people said they checked 37 times a day. It was actually 85. They were closer on the durations, but they're all still a little bit off. So when you're one prediction is in habit mode, you'll kind of forget how often you did things. And that may itself be an interesting, for example, it used to be the consumer price index, a lot of it is based on diary recollections of purchases. And if people are in habit mode, we're not getting the right numbers. And now again, the people who work on those types of survey are well aware of potential response bias. We're not saying response biases aren't thought about, but this is an example of where memory biases may actually enter into some of the types of data that get consumed as economic data. This is a funny example from William Bennett. Obviously, this is not just habit, but maybe self-image and embarrassment. He wrote this big long book of virtues, has recently endorsed Donald Trump. And he said, since I'm Catholic, if you're Catholic, gambling's not a vice, it's okay. That's why I ran out of room in my book to talk about gambling. And he actually gambled with slot machines for 10 years. And so the question is, how much did he recall losing? What he said in an interview was, I came out pretty close to even. No, I don't think so. He lost $8 million, okay? Let me do one more study and then I'll just stop. And another thing that is consistent with the habit story would be under-searching. So that if you fit, as many people have done, including my colleague Matt Shum at Caltech, if you fit a kind of search model and you try to infer from choice and price dispersion what the sort of latent search cost might be, you sometimes would get very high numbers. So one study that did this, for example, using grocery cart radio tags, so you know exactly where people were and for how long they were standing, at the mustard shelf or mayonnaise, they get an inferred search cost of $126 an hour. And that's consistent with the story in which if people are in habit mode, they're not looking at alternative prices quickly enough. Again, you could tell other kinds of stories, but that's just a fact. Let me end with one. If you live in London, you have these Oyster cards. Okay, and there's three interesting things about London. A lot of people use Oyster cards to commute, so that the Transportation Authority knows, a group of people who swipe their card at the same entryway and the same exit for 10 days in a row. Before there was a strike, the strike was great because it was a partial strike. It wasn't everywhere in London. So you have a reasonable control group, maybe not completely exogenous, right? But you have a reasonable control group of people who weren't subject to the strike. And the other thing that's kind of cool is the tube map shown here is not drawn to scale. Because if you drew it to scale, a lot of the stations are close together and others are really far apart. So they kind of artificially, somebody told me it was drawn by a circuit engineer to look more like a kind of circuit. And what that means is, if you're looking for alternative routes, you don't necessarily know the time cost, like how far apart the stations are, or if you get out and walk 2 blocks, it's hard to judge. So that's actually kind of an advantage. That means that if people have to pick a new route, you might be able to tell from the map. In other words, the map is not the perfect model-directed guide to all alternative actions. And so the question is, how many people after this strike changed their commute? And how valuable was that increment? And if that number is really high, again, who knows whether you could show that that was a mistake or not, but it's consistent with the idea that once they developed a commuting habit, and then they were under-searching, even though maybe other tube stops were added, or maybe there was a beautiful mall somewhere where they could stop and get, in principle, they could stop and get a delicious croissant, although there's not that many in London. And if Brexit goes through, there won't be any, right? Okay, and so what happens is, this is a paper by, I believe, Larcombe et al., really cute, is 5% of the interrupted riders switched to a better route afterwards. And the time savings was small, only 40 seconds a day, but if you do a kind of policy back in the envelope calculation, how much might that have saved them, plugging in a bunch of numbers, you get a pretty high number. So again, that's consistent with the idea that in their commuting, people quit searching a little bit too quickly in terms of the opportunity cost of having figured out a better commute.
Economic value is on an annual basis?
Yeah, I think they use median wages and infer some kind of assume the marginal opportunity cost of an hour is similar to that. There's the 126. Yeah.
It's not clear how to interpret this welfare estimate, right? Because there's a lot of ways in which we don't optimize in our life, and that might be good.
Yeah.
If you jolt somebody out of their default in any particular dimension, they'll optimize in that particular dimension. That's not necessarily good for you overall.
But in this example, what are you
So
saying?
these riders aren't taking the best route right
Correct.
now, right? And then if you force them to not take the route they've been taking, they might do something better.
Yes.
But presumably they could have spent that time optimizing on this particular dimension of transportation. But there's like a million different choices you make in your given day, and you don't optimize over all of them. So it's not clear that this particular choice was worth their time, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's hard to. It's not a clean kill, right? Because if you had said to these guys, well, there's going to be a strike, and you're going to have to find a new way to work anyway. Maybe Wednesday before the strike, you should start doing your exploring already. Maybe the optimal thing is just to wait, let the strike jar me out of it, and I'll kind of figure out what happened. I will say one thing, which is, remember in the economic model in which habit is a kind of increased utility of doing the thing you continue to do, it's not clear you should really get these interruptions, right? Because it's only 2 days. So you have this long commuting history, right? And if unless the decay rate on this adjacent complementarity is very high, right, you should probably just revert to your old commute if there's this persistence. And so this is, again, we'd have to work a little harder to show that this is a sharp distinction, but I think that it's hard to reconcile this with a view in which if you've commuted many days in a certain way, you really wanted to continue that commute, you should go back to it after the interruption. And again, 95% of interrupted riders did persist in their commute. So I don't know if they were able to figure out if they found a better commute or not, right? It might be their commute was actually worse, and so reverting to their familiar commute. Last question.
So I was just asking about this. I guess you hinted at. So you said 5% switched and 95% didn't switch, or are you saying 5% switched and got a better route? Maybe there's like 10% who switched and went to a worse route. And can this be this? If people just switch randomly based on nothing, maybe 5% will switch to a better route. So I'm just wondering, is this
I think
people who switch?
I think there's a tiny trace of interrupted riders who switched to an inferior route. And I think most of them didn't switch.
Inferior in the time dimension. You don't know about the croissant.
That's correct. Inferior. It's inferior in time, exactly. And so, exactly. Anyway, so, okay. There's a bunch of examples from other domains in which it seemed to be pretty high inferred search cost or switching costs from things which are actually not that hard to switch. This is a recent paper by Ali Urtachi, for example. Texas set up this website where it's actually pretty easy to shop around among different utilities for electricity, and they said it basically takes 15 minutes. And in some of these cases, like in Texas, they actually were emailing people, check your electricity, you can save money, So this is more like every day, gee, I should be figuring out how to save money on my phone bill. We'll skip that one, although it's quite a famous example. Okay, so what we tried to do here is to present a neuroeconomic model, and that we're trying to take both sides at least somewhat seriously in a whirlwind talk. The economic part is that we want to write down a formal concept of habit and see if in the middle part of the talk, and then see if we can make predictions about something very conventional, which is not mysterious that there's long or short run differences. It's a little more mysterious that there may be wrongly signed cross-price elasticities and log demand violations. But we want to be able to say, can we say something about when the long or short run are? That's like a little thing. And the neuro part is that we came at this from these ideas from ethology and neuroscience about these multiple control processes. And I should add that theorists are always telling us, can you show if this habit system is optimal? And it would be a useful thing to do. It would be very complicated. It's not my comparative advantage. Far away from it. To say, given some priors about price dispersion and maybe discount factor of future rewards, what would be an optimal threshold function in which it would make sense to revert to habit mode? It might be the threshold function would be a function of volatility, or would be able to say something about these partial reinforcement effects or something like that. And in which case, we think of our model as a kind of candidate starter reduced form conjecture about how an optimal combination of model directed and habitual behavior might